6 and set number 3.
This jet is the biggest commercially built passenger aircraft in the world. It is built in the biggest building in the world. It carries the President of the United States of America. It ferries the space shuttle. It will soon blast missiles out of the sky with a laser. It has flown 15 million flights, totaling 35 billion miles, 74,000 trips to the moon and back. And as this mighty jet dominates the skies, it makes the world a smaller place. The Boeing 747 is a jet of gigantic proportions. Built so big that it still holds onto the size record after more than 3 decades of flight. Today, this machine's might still inspires those who built it to boast.
We're the biggest and the best. The whole world over, everybody recognizes the profile of this airplane. Everybody knows that everything else is just an airplane, but this is a 747.
I'm out there with my child at the runway or something like that, and I see one of these take off and flying, and it's 100% satisfaction. You see something you built actually flying through the air. And you tell your children, you know, I made that.
But this jet is more than the sum of its staggering dimensions.
The first giant 747 is presented to the world.
1, 2, 3!
The 747 has a mythical stature that remains undiminished. Cutting-edge technology, the passion of the people who build it, the 98-acre building in Everett, Washington, where these giant jets are built. These are the elements that combine to make the story of the Boeing 747 a tale of testing the limits, then flying far beyond them.
Many of the people, from the engineers, the mechanics, the management that are here today, their fathers, their grandfathers, and aunts and uncles have all worked on the 747. I think all of us view it as a really important legacy that it's now our watch. It's our turn to carry on from here and make the airplane better and better.
They say first impressions are everything. And one thought pops into anyone's mind the first time they encounter a Boeing 747.
This airplane is huge.
Even the people who work with the jet day in and day out remain stunned by its size.
It's because it's so big, you're just so awestruck by it.
The extreme size was something that you wouldn't think would ever get off the ground.
The awesome dimensions of the 747-400, the most current version of the jet, dwarf every other commercial jet in production today. This jet is 231 feet 10 inches long. If someone could manage to stand a 747 on its tail in Seattle's Safeco Field, the stadium's retractable roof would need to be open, because the jet's nose would poke out of the ballpark about 15 feet. The 747-400's wings cover a 5,600 square foot area. They could serve as a parking lot for 45 mid-sized cars. And when this jet is filled to its capacity with fuel, the wingspan grows. Full tanks pull the wings down slightly, and the span grows from 211 feet to 213.
1186 or Kilo 12, looks like we have a clear shot to our alley.
1186
Kilo 13 to the gate, and
The jet's cockpit sits 29 feet above the ground. And talk about a tall tail. The empennage, or tail section, tops out at 63 feet, the height of a 5-story apartment building. Even something as light as air takes on a certain weight when it encounters the jumbo.
I suppose that the scale can't be underestimated, when you think about the fact that when it's pressurized, the cabin is so enormous that the air inside of it weighs more than a ton.
Fully fueled and loaded to capacity, the 747-400 can weigh up to 875,000 pounds. And Boeing will break that barrier soon with a brand new version of the jet called the 747-400ER, which stands for Extended Range. That behemoth will weigh in at 910,000 pounds. Heavy metal indeed.
The most amazing thing about the 400 is just how many people and how much cargo and baggage we put on, and then we add the fuel on top of it, and the thing just takes off. It never ceases to amaze me how these things get off the ground. It's just bewildering.
These things get off the ground with the help of 4 engines that generate a total of more than 250,000 pounds of thrust. More power than 7 F-18 fighter jets combined. Thanks to the physics of thrust and lift, when a 747 closes in on 200 miles per hour on the runway, a miracle called rotation occurs, and 875,000 pounds of aluminum, fuel, passengers, and cargo lifts itself skyward.
But on takeoff, on rotation, the pilot was sitting 50 feet up in the air, and the passenger in the last row of the airplane, right at the back, was about 3 feet from the runway. So you can imagine that's quite a big machine.
That takeoff becomes even more amazing when you realize that the Wright brothers' first flight could have been accomplished within the 150 feet of the 747's economy section. Don't let the 747's bulk fool you. It's fast, too. This jet reaches speeds of up to 720 miles per hour during testing.
The airplane was designed with a high-speed wing when it was originally designed. The wing has been improved somewhat over the years, but and to this day is still the fastest subsonic commercial jet transport in the world.
And though the indicators on the 47 don't go over Mach 1, sometimes during testing, the jet does. That's over 750 miles an hour.
When we do flutter testing to show that the airplane high-speed characteristics are acceptable, we're required to fly out to 0.97 or 97% of the speed of sound. And that's a very dynamic condition. It involves diving the airplane pretty sharply. And then you have to do maneuvers once you get to that Mach number. There have been probably cases where there has been, at least locally on the airplane, some supersonic flow.
Airports around the world spent millions on renovations to accommodate the big new jet.
A key part of the 747 introduction into service, and again even more so with the 400, was how on earth do we fit this around an airport that's built for smaller jets? And that was a key question. In fact, so much so that it helped define what's called the 80-meter box, which is the outside diameter, or the outside dimensions of a notional box within which everybody has tried to stay since.
Airport blast fences also grew. The better to deal with a 300-mile-an-hour jet velocity that explodes 100 feet behind this plane when the engines are fully throttled up. Even though the Boeing 747-400 is the fastest and the biggest, Those aren't the only reasons this grand jet qualifies as a superstructure. It takes a city's worth of people, more than 6 million parts, and the world's biggest building to build the world's biggest jet. From hand riveting to the handshake of final delivery to a customer.
Thank you very much.
The process by which the Boeing 747 is built is as mind-boggling as seeing the final product take to the skies. When Boeing launched the 747 program in 1966, the company had yet to purchase the land the jets would be built on. The company finally selected a 773-acre site in Everett, Washington. The record-breaking jet was built just steps behind the record-breaking building that housed it.
So they built the building and they got about 3/4 of the way done, and in the back shops they started loading the first airplane's parts and were actually assembling the airplane as they were putting the roof on the end of the building.
Today, the building where Boeing built its wide-body jets sprawls over 98 acres. Enough space for 911 professional basketball courts. This place has held fast to the record for the world's largest building by volume for more than 30 years. One urban legend has it that this structure houses its own weather patterns.
It is a city, everything from fire departments to medical staffs to food service. I mean, you name it, you got it in this building. It is a small city.
An aluminum avalanche of jet parts pours into this behemoth building via cargo ship, train, truck, and yes, cargo-carrying 747s. 670 vendors from all over the world supply the more than 6 million parts that eventually become a Boeing 747-400. From the lowly rivet, a mighty jet is born. More than half of those 6 million parts that build the Boeing 747 are fasteners. Jeff Hatfield is one of the more than 1,000 people it takes to assemble one of these jets. Working on the biggest commercial airliner in the world is a source of pride for him.
You know, it's neat. It's a good feeling inside, seeing something fly around that you worked on, put together, built.
In fact, there's an element of pride in this entire population of factory workers whose job is to transform parts on pallets into jumbo jets.
Actually, we're pretty proud of how fast we can actually build a 747. If you look at the time, the very first part that comes into this factory, from that time to the time we actually deliver it to an airline customer, it's approximately 4 months, somewhere in that neighborhood, 4.5 months.
In those 4.5 months, panels of prefabricated aluminum become subassemblies like wings, tail sections, and fuselage parts. Those parts are then put together during the night shift in an exacting process called final body joint.
We like to tell everybody this is the first time it actually becomes a real airplane. Until now, it's just pieces.
So the front end, the middle, with the wings attached, and the back end, those 3 major sections all come into what we call final body joint.
The final body joint couldn't happen. Indeed, the jet couldn't be built without this highway in the sky. 31 miles of crane tracks, 9 stories above the factory floor.
149, Lenny, any luck on that access stand?
A network so big, it requires its own control tower.
10-4, cab 7, guy.
Cab 7, we're 24, go ahead.
18 cranes, some capable of carrying 40 tons each, ply the vast upper reaches of this building, putting jet parts in their place.
It's just a lot of work and a lot of movement, and what we call it is the dance in the sky, because if you look here at about 1, 2 o'clock in the morning on a line move night, things are flying all over the place, and it's a real choreography.
Merging massive fuselage panels with microscopic precision was once a matter of moving slowly and eyeballing the gap.
It never went together exactly the same way every time. So we had a lot of really great mechanics that, thank God they were, because without their knowledge and skill, never could have got them to come together.
Today, a digital design system called CATIA, which stands for Computer-Aided Three-Dimensional Interactive Applications, helps standardize the 47's fuselage parts and makes joining them a more precise process.
Now that we had digital engineering, basically is a Lego approach. You take one Lego and you match the holes in the Lego up with the hole or the peg in the other Lego, and you put them together.
Getting the final body join right is crucial.
This is what determines how the airplane's going to fly. If we don't get the sections set straight, then we have all sorts of issues when it gets to the field about setting trim on the horizontal and vertical stabilizers.
This is the point where the jet begins to look like what was ordered. In this case, a passenger carrier for Lufthansa. After the final body joint, this jumbo will move to the first of 3 slant positions, where workers attach and test internal systems, replace 14,000-pound cement blocks with actual engines, and add other final touches prior to painting. Boeing began experimenting at the end of 2001 with building the 747-400 on a moving line. They're hoping to make the process more efficient by having the jets move constantly at a rate of 1 foot per hour through the final stages of assembly.
This is a huge, huge change in the build process. It's pretty radical for some of those that have been in the industry for a long time to see this happen.
Almost complete 747-400s leave the final assembly building at the rate of 1 every 8 nights, which gives you an idea of how tightly this production schedule must be managed. The jumbos are usually pulled from the assembly building and towed over to the paint building during the dead of night. The jets must travel over Washington State Route 526 on an overpass, and the spectacle would likely back up traffic for miles if it occurred during daylight. During the paint process, the 747 loses that green-tinted coating of protective vinyl and gains about 1,200 pounds of paint. Then, the nearly finished brand-new jumbo jet takes its place on the flight line, where it awaits its first flight. The first time this giant jet takes to the skies, it is flown by a Boeing test pilot. That first flight is called a B-1 flight. After a successful B-1 flight comes the customer, or C-1 flight.
It's Boeing 006 on HF 2851.
Captain Werner Meyerhofer, a longtime Lufthansa pilot, will do the honors with this jet.
To me, it's the best airplane in the world. I used to be on a 737 before that, and that's a nice airplane too, but this is the queen of the skies. Boeing Everett, Boeing 006, radio check.
Boeing 747-400s cost between $180 and $200 million. And customers inspect their investments inside and out before finalizing their purchase.
Fuel override center left.
Everything from vital systems like engines to cosmetic details invisible to the untrained eye are given the white glove treatment. Kicking the tires of a brand new 747-400 is one of Captain Meyerhofer's favorite job duties.
It feels great, it feels special. It's a thing you don't do very often. Okay, sail call is loud and clear.
This jet sails smoothly through its inspection flights, which means it will go through its final delivery on schedule. Final delivery is more about moving money than moving jets.
Is this the export declaration for U.S. Customs or for state tax purposes?
Imagine closing on a $200,000 house. Multiply the cost of the house by 1,000. Involve international banks, local, state, and federal taxes. Get customs agencies involved. And you have an idea of how complicated the final transaction is.
Here's the little bill of sale. Yeah, bill of sale. $12.49. Done deal. Probably not surprised. We have a couple of keys to the cockpit. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Finally, the deal is done. Boeing's 1,293rd 747 becomes the newest addition to Lufthansa's fleet. The ink on the paper is still wet, and Captain Meyerhofer is taking this brand new jet from its Western Washington birthplace to its new home in Frankfurt, Germany. No matter what role a person plays in taking this jet from parts and boxes to its final takeoff from Painfield and Everett, the moment it leaves is as grand as the jet itself.
When you first see one take off on a delivery to a customer, taken off the airfield, it's a really good feeling. It's very satisfying. It's hard to describe. It's overwhelming, really. It really is.
Every time a brand new 747-400 takes to the skies and leaves Boeing's Everett plant, it's a testament to this company's vision. The origins of the 747's design go back to World War II and Boeing's military bombers. In particular, the B-47, the first swept-wing jet bomber. The origins of the 747's purpose go back to Boeing's dominance in the passenger airline industry. Boeing's 10-passenger Model 247 was dubbed the first modern passenger airliner when it debuted in 1933. Prop planes got people where they needed to fly until Boeing introduced the first jet passenger liner in 1954. The 707, or Dash 80, is the queen mother of all modern-day Boeing commercial jets.
In the 60s, the development of the jet airliner really was coming into its own. You had the 707 and DC-8 in the States, the Convair family, VC-10 in Europe, and a myriad of new developments that were coming through in short to medium range airliners too. And what they were doing were establishing the new levels of safety and reliability in air transport.
In the mid-1960s, the world economy was booming, the population was growing, and passenger demand for jet travel was rocketing at the rate of 15% a year. Suddenly, Boeing 707, which carried 120 passengers, just wasn't big enough anymore.
This was just so far beyond the capacity of the airlines to deal with at that time. So the airlines themselves were feeling the onslaught of this great demand, and they were the ones that started knocking on Boeing's door to say, hey, we want something bigger, we need something bigger.
Juan Trippe, chairman of the then industry giant Pan Am, knocked the loudest in 1966. If Boeing could develop a jet that could carry 350 passengers at Mach 0.9 on transoceanic routes, Pan Am would buy. Boeing said Pan Am had themselves a deal. During development, there were people who doubted this jet would ever fly.
I was asked to head up a small study group.
Joe Sutter was director of engineering on the 747 program and is thought of as the father of the jumbo jet.
We knew we could do the airplane from an engineering standpoint. What the airplane looked like was the biggest question.
Two versions of what the Boeing 747 could have become are this double-decker jet and this wide-body that was nicknamed the Anteater. Today's jet more resembles the Anteater with its wide body and flight deck separate from the main deck cabin area. And what about the 747's most distinctive feature, the hump?
The rumor that it's the hump's here so the pilot can sit on his wallet isn't true. Well, the hump was part of the fact that we wanted to make a freighter airplane. So we put the cockpit above the main deck so we could have nose-in loading.
The 747 has the distinction of carrying more cargo than any other jet in the world.
So the 747 passenger airplane is truly amazing, but the freighter is awesome. It's the most economical way you can ship freight by air, whether it's 1 ton or 120 tons on the airplane. We've carried everything from whales to oil drilling equipment to a fleet of racehorses.
There was no way to predict the 747's success back in the late 60s.
You've got to remember, this airplane was so big, it was 2.5 times larger than the largest airplane in the sky at the time in terms of passenger capacity. It was a giant by every measurement.
On a wet February day in 1968, 747 number 1 was about to fly for the first time.
I took my wife, Nancy, and put her where the airplane was going to lift off because so many people had asked her the question, does your husband know this airplane will even fly? So I told Nancy, we know how it's going to fly, and if you stand here, the airplane will take off right here.
Brian Weigel was co-pilot aboard the brand new jet.
Spread them around for me, Brian. Watch those hips.
It was with great relief, I think, when we finally taxied out and everything was working and the engines were running fine and we were okay. I think when we lifted off, it sent a great surge of emotion through us. We were busy, so we didn't hoot and holler, I don't think. I think we looked at each other and grinned broadly, but, you know, we had radio communications and things to do.
The biggest, newest jet in the world defied her detractors and gravity with that flight.
And here was this huge airplane that a lot of people didn't see how it could get in the air just because it was so big and so heavy, you know, and there it was, flew beautifully, came back, landed beautifully, taxied in.
Okay, Jack, natural question is, what are your impressions?
Something that thing is just ridiculously easy to fly. It's just a pilot's dream.
That successful first flight marked the beginning of a rigorous and dangerous phase of the jet's development, flight testing. Testing was, and still is, an expensive process of controlled destruction. New jets are pushed to the absolute limits of their capacity in the air and on the ground. Generations of 747 test pilots pushed these jets from the days of the 100s to the 400s being manufactured today. Brian Weigel was current-day test pilot Joe McDonald's boss. He had this bit of advice for his employees.
Should be careful.
This blazing brake test is called a rejected takeoff. Pilots must accelerate at maximum weight, maximum speed, then stop dead just prior to takeoff. Then they must sit for 5 minutes, doing absolutely nothing, while a ground crew assesses the situation to simulate real-life conditions.
You destroy with each test, you completely destroy a set of wheels, tires, and brakes, which is worth even in those days, tens of thousands of dollars.
Today, the same rejected takeoff test is done on the state-of-the-art carbon brakes on the 747-400. But a bad call on the ground crew's part is a bit more expensive.
Someone has to make a pretty critical call because the test costs, I think, on the order of about $1 million to do. You don't want to redo it if you don't have to.
The original 5 747s were put through the most rigorous testing program ever performed on a civilian jet.
This concludes the final type certification report for the Model 747. Thank you all, Tim.
Less than a year after that Virgin flight, the first commercial Boeing 747 entered service for Pan Am in January of 1970, flying non-stop from New York to London. The 747 became a bestseller. The 747-200, a structurally stronger version of the 100, came out in 1970. Air Force One is a 200. The 747-300, with its stretched upper deck and capacity for yet 44 more passengers, debuted in 1982. As the 747 line evolved, the jet's makers boasted theirs was the biggest. Today, more than 15 million flights and 35 billion miles later, that's still true. Today's Boeing 747 is a brand new jet, a machine completely different from 747 number 1, the city of Everett, which now awaits restoration funding in a lot near Boeing Field in Seattle. Boeing kept this jet, RA-001, to use for testing. Its 4 brothers, the 4 other original test jets, are still operational. One was retrofitted as a cargo jet and flies to this day. The 747-400s being built in Boeing's Everett plant today have exterior and interior innovations that simply didn't exist when the jet was first developed.
The 747-400 was a reaction to the airline's needs and a reaction to the fact that there was a lot of technology that we could add to the 747 that would improve its reliability, its maintainability, lower its production cost. And it really was, if you think about it, a remake of the airplane from a system standpoint.
Today's jet is bigger, of course. This jet carries more passengers, weighs 140,000 more pounds, and flies 3,000 miles further than its predecessors. One of the most visible differences on the 747-400 are winglets. These composite and aluminum tips extend upward about 6 feet on the end of each wing, where they trap and utilize air that would otherwise bleed off the end of the wing.
They added to the efficiency of the wing, and they provide a little extra range by increasing the effective lift of the wing.
Also, thanks to the winglets, the 400 can squeeze into a standard-sized airport stall and still enjoy the benefits of a bigger wingspan. Mechanic Corey Stollup rarely gets called by his real name.
No, they call me the winglet guy, among other things.
Ironically, these high-tech NASA-developed composite and aluminum winglets are applied to the jet in a rather low-tech manner. At 140 pounds each, they're so light, it only takes a couple of helpers.
Thank you, gentlemen.
A lift.
Then beat it into place.
And a bright orange mallet to get the job done. Big changes took place inside the 747-400 as well, especially on the flight deck. Older 747s were flown by 3 crew members: pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer.
This is Boeing 006 on HF2851.
But Boeing wanted a standardized cockpit, so flight crews could easily transition from one Boeing airplane to another.
Okay, we have a test pass.
The really huge change was to go from 3 flight crew members on the flight deck to 2. So we eliminated the position of the flight engineer.
Crews had to get used to the new cockpit's ability to do a lot of the tasks people once did. Computers on this jet could figure out the most efficient route, check tire pressure, even automatically land the jet. This is the original cockpit. Contrast that with the new look.
Thank you. The airplane tells us everything which is not normal.
Digital cathode ray instrument displays replaced dated electromechanical or steam gauges.
Mark.
And the 400s currently coming off the line are further improved with more reliable liquid crystal instrument displays. There were some numbers that went down when the 747-400 was developed. Flight crews on older 747s had to monitor 971 lights, gauges, and switches. That number now stands at a more sensible 365. Decibels went down as well. The 400 had newer, faster, more efficient engines that have to meet stricter noise regulations. And these quieter engines can now take this jumbo jet more than 8,000 miles non-stop. The changes most customers notice are interior features. They've come a long way, baby. Though doubtless some nostalgia buffs wouldn't mind going back to the days of spiral staircases and orange upholstery. Some completely revamped 747-400 interiors can accommodate a whopping 568 passengers.
This is the crew rest for our cabin crew.
Crew sleeping bunks were added behind the cockpit and above the ceiling in the tail section, since flights can last longer than 16 hours. New fire-resistant paneling was added, and an improvement near and dear to any traveler's heart. Bigger overhead stowage bins give the 400 more capacity per passenger than any other wide-bodied plane. Or if you check your luggage, the 747's handlers load more than 42 tons of baggage onto the jet in less than 7 minutes.
For its size, I think among the Boeing test pilots at least, it's widely regarded as the easiest airplane to land.
This giant's gentle landings are due in part to ground effect. The jet's massive size actually compresses the air beneath it as it gets closer to the ground, creating an invisible cushion that softens the landing. The 747's most obvious claim to fame may be its size, but this jet's combination of prestige and versatility has landed it some pretty interesting jobs.
The most famous 747 that we have is Air Force One.
You know, everywhere I go in that airplane, I am the second most important celebrity. People really just want to see the plane.
The Boeing 747-200 is owned by the United States Air Force and has been fitted with everything from heat-seeking missile protection to an air-to-air refueling system. This 747 could effectively serve as an airborne White House if something should happen to the real one. And 747s don't just carry the president. One piggybacked the Space Shuttle Enterprise for NASA in the late 70s during testing. These jets have even been recruited by the military to defend the country with lasers. The ABL, Airborne Laser, is a joint project between Boeing, TRW, and Lockheed Martin to develop a modified 747 capable of blasting ballistic missiles out of the sky.
Some of the more interesting requests that I've gotten over the years, one of them was a particular Asian operator wanting to make sure it was safe to carry a very, very large sumo wrestler on board. So we had to do some analysis, make sure the floor beams were good for it. Of course it was, but we had to convince them that it was okay.
The Boeing 747 has maintained its status as sumo of the skies for more than 3 decades, while successfully grappling with and defeating the notion that it's an old jet. It's a tough set of signals to send. maintain a reputation as a classic while paying close attention to the cutting edge.
The toughest thing about being the chief engineer of the 747 is controlling our appetite for innovation. Our engineer said, why can't we just start over? Why can't we just take a clean sheet of paper with the 47 and start over? And it's like, wait, we don't want to do that. We've got a really good thing going here.
Soon, the bar won't just be raised. It'll be changed entirely. The 747 is about to meet a challenger from one of Boeing's biggest competitors. Boeing's biggest rival is developing a new jet overseas. In a move reminiscent of the early days of the 747, Airbus is building a brand new facility for the construction of their latest, the A380, a mega jumbo jet. Measuring in at 239 feet, with capacity for more than 600 passengers, this jet will be the first production jet to challenge the reign of the Queen of the Skies. Boeing isn't handing over the crown yet.
The A380 is a different airplane than the 747. It's quite a bit larger at 550 to 650 passengers. We believe that it's too big.
When Boeing developed the 747 30 years ago, the company placed a bet on a future where more people would travel further. That bet panned out. Or perhaps the jet itself helped change the way we travel.
It completely revolutionized the way that cultures and nations intermixed, because it just turned up the scale. It actually revolutionized things in capacity terms. And in a lot of ways it helped promote the interaction of societies and cultures on a scale which hadn't been seen before.
Now, by relying on the size of their current fleet of products, the company is placing another bet that more people want point-to-point travel, not the hub-to-hub system that exists now. Fragmentation is the term used to describe this split between traveling styles. Airbus and Boeing are putting their money on different variants of the fragmentation phenomenon.
We think that the world will grow up in point-to-point. They believe that the world will grow up with the same transportation infrastructure and larger aircraft will be required. The world will tell us in a few years which one made the right bet.
Meanwhile, something else is happening that recalls the days when the 747 was first being developed. Boeing is once again developing a supersonic jet. Do all of these changes in the industry spell the end of the 747? This jet has had an unprecedented run.
Nobody thought that the 747 program would still be alive and well 35 years after the first airplane came out. Nobody anticipated that.
But Boeing continues to tinker with the 747. A longer range version is currently being tested, and customers are already lining up. Money talks, and billions of dollars worth of orders says that people don't see this as an old jet.
What we think of the 747 is 30 years of continuous learning and improvement. 30 years of understanding from our customers what their needs are, improving how the product works, and adapting not only the airplane, but the way in which we produce it to the current needs of the airlines and their customers, the shippers and the passengers.
The 747 model has already surpassed all expectations of longevity. Will it be around much longer?
The demand is such that I think we'll see 747s flying for at least another 50 years in some cases. I would honestly say that.
If that prediction is correct, the 747 may have to hand over its title as the biggest commercial jet in the skies, but it will likely gain another, longest lived. And a legacy like the one that continues to grow for the 747 doesn't come from being the biggest thing in the skies. It comes from the dedicated characters who built and continue to build a jet they believe in.
I still stand there and look at the airplane, look at the factory it's built in, and think about what we do. I mean, it's a miracle of capability and working together. Every time a 747 gets put together with its millions of parts and takes off from Everett Field. Maybe the real miracle is the fact that nearly 1,300 of those 747s have done just exactly that.